A lot of times, spiritual abuse and church scandals feel like they come out of nowhere. But what if I told you that if we know what to look for, we can actually see these things coming a mile away? And more importantly, we can see them coming before the damage is done, before people are hurt, before people are traumatized. We can see it coming and do something about it. Well, that's exactly what today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast is about. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the formula for spiritual abuse. Because yes, there is a formula that when we see it in our churches, we can know that if something doesn't change, spiritual abuse, grievous sin, church scandal, those things are on their way. Now, the good news is when we recognize the spiritual abuse formula and we see it early and we do something about it, none of those things have to happen, because I believe there is a time frame where things can be corrected and people can be protected if and only if we know what to look for. And you are going to be surprised, I think, at least I was when I started looking at this, at how simple the formula for spiritual abuse is, for the misuse of power and authority in our churches. Because it is very, very simple. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And if we'll start looking early in our churches and saying, hey, is the formula for spiritually abusive practices here? If we'll start asking that question, then we'll know how to deal with it long before it becomes an issue. So if you're ready to find out about the formula for spiritual abuse and church scandals, then let's go ahead and dive into today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. Today, I'm joined by co-host Vicki May and Shawn Reece. Thanks, guys, so much for being with us today. And this is a podcast topic I've wanted to do for a really long time. I was telling you guys before we hit record, this is actually one of the first podcast topics I wrote down. And I just haven't felt like it was the right time to do it quite yet. And I really felt like I got the green light from the Lord, not trying to sound over-spiritual, but felt like this was a good time to do it. And today what we're talking about the formula for spiritual abuse. Mm-hmm. What is the formula that pretty much always leads to spiritual abuse? And what is the formula we find after spiritual abuse has happened that always seems to be there? Now, you guys are smart people, whether it's y'all or someone who's listening, someone's going to find an example where this didn't happen, okay? Mm-hmm. So maybe it doesn't happen 100% of the time, but 99.9% of the time, this is the formula for spiritual abuse. So I want us to look at how this actually pops up in spiritual abuse cases, how it pops up in different church hurt situations. But more than that, I want us to be able to help audience members see what this looks like before it turns into spiritual abuse. When we see these things, it means when we see this formula pop up, it means we have to do something immediately or we have to shake the dust off our feet and leave. Mm-hmm. We cannot be a part of churches where this formula is present, okay? And there's a lot of people can talk a good game. When you see this formula, it's very simple, but they can explain to you why it's not quite that, okay? Yep. When the formula is not there, nobody has to explain it away. You know that. When the formula is there, it doesn't matter how good the things they say sound. If you've got questions about it, either something has to be done immediately or we have to shake the dust off our feet, we have to leave. And that is painful. But part of the reason why we have so many spiritual abuse cases right now, part of the reason why the church is getting so many black eyes is because we continue to stay and make excuses where we're comfortable long after we've seen the signs of danger. So we talk about a lot of red flags. Our red flag reviews talk about a lot of red flags, and red flags in a church don't necessarily mean that spiritual abuse has happened. Mm-hmm. Vicki, we talked about on another podcast that we recorded this morning. All it means is when those red flags are there, that there's fertile soil for spiritual abuse to grow. Now this is different. Today's topic, when you see the formula for spiritual abuse, when you see these two things together, It's already there. You may not see it. It may not have been reported, but I can promise you it's already there. Because the moment these two things collide, they coincide, we have spiritual abuse at its lowest levels, and it's only going to grow if we don't do something about it. So we're going to talk about the formula for spiritual abuse. We're going to look at recent scandals and spiritual abuse cases and see where this was. We're going to talk about what these things look like, because these two things can look very different in different contexts. But one of the things we want to say right off the bat is this formula for spiritual abuse, it occurs in all sizes of churches and all denominational style of churches. This is not a mega church thing. It's not an evangelical thing. It's not a small church thing, a Catholic thing, an Orthodox thing, a mainline thing. This is a church thing, okay? But what you're going to see, the two pieces of this formula are never what Jesus called us to. They're never the fruit of the Spirit, right? But when we get off in these ways, we're always going to give a different kind of fruit. And the fruit we're going to grow, it's the pain and the destruction of good people who Jesus died for. So let's go ahead and get into it today. Before we jump in, and y'all know what the formula is, but before I told you what the formula was, before you got here just a little bit ago, you didn't really know what it was. What were some of the questions or thoughts that popped into your mind before you knew the formula when I simply said, hey, this is what we're going to talk about?
For me, it was specific situations. Like you talked about the formula, and and I think this is like an offshoot of some of the things, but like nepotism popped into my head. Whether it's family or friends or whatever, that always that kind of thing popped into my head. Or and then what the actual formula is, I don't want to say it because I don't want to ruin your reveal, but those things popped into my head too, but not necessarily in the same way. But yeah, for me, I think the first thing that I thought was nepotism.
Yeah, so you started thinking about what would the individual pieces be, and nepotism was at the top of your list.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing, honestly, I don't know if this will actually air before this episode or after, but it's our plan right now to do a podcast episode on nepotism with Natalie Runyon.
Yeah.
She wanted to follow up after our last conversation. We talked about nepotism a little bit, and it sparked some really intense conversations, some intense fellowship online. And Natalie and I disagree on when nepotism becomes a problem. Because again, I'm a hardliner where I'm just like, hey, if it could become a problem, let's just not do it. Like there's so many churches you don't have to work or serve where your mom and dad served, right?
Yeah.
But other people see that differently. But you're right, nepotism does come up in a lot of these cases. But I think this formula actually shows exactly why it becomes an issue when it does, right? It's not about nepotism. It's about what tends to come from nepotism. So what about you, Vicki? When you first heard, hey, here's what we're talking about, it's the formula for spiritual abuse, what came to mind?
Well, I just think, again, it's sort of, it's a big, overwhelming thing to sort of think about, like, where does the root start? And I was thinking about individual things that I have felt or seen, similar to you, Shawn, about like nepotism and things like that. But I don't know. In my mind, I was like, this could really sort of be complicated, but yet simplified in an overall scheme of things. So, it was a little overwhelming to think about, actually.
So when you heard the formula, did it let you take a breath, like a deep breath and just exhale? Because it's very simple.
It's very simple in the fact that it was like, yes, those two things equal. So, and those two things cover what all was going on in my head. Yeah.
Well, because when we look at things like spiritual abuse, and SAI's work is going to be complex because this is a complex issue. It is going to be complicated because this is a complicated issue. But before we can ever solve an issue, we have to be able to zoom out. And instead of seeing the complexities, we have to be able to zoom out, find the root. And when we find the root, zoom in all the way toward it. Because if we attack the root, we're going to solve the problem. And if we don't attack the root, it's like pulling weeds. It's going to grow in the next 2 weeks. It's going to be in my yard again, right? And so far what the church has done, what Christians have done with spiritual abuse, one, we haven't really, we still have a lot of Christendom that doesn't want to say it's a thing, okay? And those that do, what we've been doing is we've been pulling at these weeds, these symptoms, okay? And we're going to do work with the individual symptoms. But at the end of the day, we had to know before we really started this work and launched SAI, what is the root that leads to this? So I'm a systems guy, and kind of with our board and stuff, I had to look at it and say, hey, what is the root that we need to attack here? And everything that we do with SAI needs to help people recognize this. It needs to help churches deal with this. It needs to come up with systems to protect against this. So that's everything that we're doing is coming down to these pieces, right?
Mhm.
So here is the formula for spiritual abuse. And 99.9% of the time, when you find a spiritually abusive environment, you find a church scandal. Think about things like IHOP recently with Mike Bickle. Think about things like Gateway with Robert Morris. Think about Willow Creek a few years ago. Think about Albert Tate at the end of last year. You can go on and on and on and on and on. Every single one of these scandals, when you look into it, here's what was going on, right? The formula for spiritual abuse is very simple. It's power plus deception equals spiritual abuse. When you have power plus deception, you're always going to end up with a spiritually abusive environment and spiritually abusive leaders. Now, we're going to talk about both of those, okay? Both of those lead to damage, okay? They lead to church hurt. The difference is I think they have to happen together to lead to spiritual abuse on the regular, okay? Systemically, okay? But both of these in isolation can become issues. When they're put together. It's like throwing gasoline on the fire, okay? It is going to spread. It's going to get out of control. But let's talk about power first. Power plus deception equals spiritual abuse. Power itself is not bad. Someone is always going to have power or authority in any organization or any system. So we're talking about specific power here. And here's what I think, and you guys tell me if there's anything you think I'm missing that you would want to add. But I think about two things. I think about one, concentrated power, overly concentrated power. And that means one person has the majority of the power, or one family, that's where nepotism comes in, has the majority of the power, and family members are brought in. So the power looks like it's being shared, but it's really with one family, and then there's going to be one person calling the shots in that family, right? Concentrated power looks like there's only a few people, even if they're not, related, but there's a pastor and his handpicked board who are all his friends who have power. Concentrated power could look like we have a real board, but half of them are employees of the church that could be fired by the pastor who sits on the board. That's concentrated power. So concentrated power looks a lot of different ways, but concentrated power is one of the first negatives that we're looking for, okay? If it's not concentrated power, it can be unchecked power. And unchecked power simply means there is someone or a group of someones who can make unilateral decisions that cannot be checked, or they're extremely difficult to be checked. So if you're a part of a congregational leadership model, you may have concentrated power, but it's not necessarily unchecked, okay? And a lot of times the reason why it's concentrated is because they're trying to keep it from being checked, okay? But in a congregational model, somebody can call a vote at any point and say, I'm calling for the pastor's removal, right? So you have to be careful how you do that. In an unchecked power model, you may have an elder board that says, hey, our bylaws say the only way we can remove a pastor is moral failure and heresy. And I've actually I mentioned this on the podcast before, but I had a church tell me that, and they were a non-denominational church. So I had someone who was in power, one of the high-level executive pastors said, it's almost impossible to fire a pastor and prove heresy because we're a non-denominational church, which means if we don't catch this pastor with their hand in the cookie jar doing something that everybody agrees is moral failure, which basically meant to them, if we don't catch him cheating on his wife, okay, then we can't remove him, and everything else they should be restored from, even down to like alcohol addiction, stuff like that. Oh, we'll just work to restore them, right? Because they can't literally get rid of them. It's a question we had about Gateway, and I don't know if this is true or not, but with Gateway, even when everything came out, Robert Morris resigned. The elder board didn't remove him. And I had the question, could they actually remove him given the circumstances of what was put out there, right? And I don't know if they could have, right? So that's unchecked power. There's no one who can realistically, in a quick way, say something's wrong here. Let's put this before everybody. Let's take care of this. That it's really hard to check that power. So when it comes to power, unchecked power is a big one that I see. I see concentrated power is the other big piece. Those are misuses and abuses of power. Okay. And when you misuse and abuse power, you will eventually misuse and abuse people every time. So when you guys look at it, are there any other parts of the power component of this formula that I'm missing or that you see as problematic that we haven't talked about?
Now, I normally don't play this side or stay on this side of thing, but the abuse of power can also go the other way. So I grew up in congregation-led churches, and I've worked in several, and I've known several pastors and people who have, where the congregation or a specific group in the congregation, maybe some of the largest tithers or stuff, they have an inordinate amount of power over everybody else.
Yeah.
And so they leverage that against the pastors, which also creates a form of spiritual abuse, because you're and I think a lot of times we don't think about it going that direction as well.
Yeah.
Especially, I think a lot of people who listen to this have felt it from the direction of the spiritual authority over them doing this, and not the other way around. And I don't know if that's, I guess that falls into either one of those categories, but it's a type of a abuse of power that's because that group doesn't have a spiritual authority, a biblical spiritual authority over the staff or the pastors or whatever.
Yeah.
But they still can do that, have that spiritual abuse to them. They can push that to them. So they have a type of power over them.
So in that case, they're abusing the power that was given to them. So like that congregational power, we know when we speak, the rest of the congregation's not going to check us for whatever reason. And the pastor can't check us because we'll stop giving, we'll stop tithing, or we'll perform a coup because they know if we say it, everybody else is going to follow it. So back in episode 40 with Lauren Hildebrand, we talked to him and he said, I actually found healing from spiritual abuse in the megachurch because I'd worked in small churches with these congregational models where I was abused in that way. He said, I experienced spiritual abuse at the hands of deacons that ran amok and parishioners that ran amok. So again, though, when we look at that, this is not just top down from the pastors. Spiritual abuse can happen in any type of church. Okay. Well, the power dynamic in small congregationally led churches is generally not with the pastor. When done well, those congregationally led churches, the power is split between like your elders and your congregation and the staff, or your deacons and the congregation and the staff. If the congregation gets too much power, it's out of balance. Because if the congregation gets too much power, there will always be a couple who get more power than everybody else and lead. So that is, to me, it's still a concentration of power, and in some ways, unchecked power, because what will we do if they stop giving?
Yeah.
They're basically paying for all of this stuff, right? Which is something we have to deal with SAI. We've had people who have given big gifts, right? We've had people who have said, I will give this big gift if you'll change the way that you talk about this, if you'll work on this certain project. And we've had to turn it down to say, hey, that project is not something that we feel led to work on missionally. I've also had to, tell someone, hey, I appreciate you giving the feedback, but we don't agree missionally that that's the direction that we need to go. Well, I'm not going to give to you then. That's fine. Stop listening to. Like you threatening not to give is not going to change what we do. Right. But if we're not careful, that could become an unchecked power situation with a donor. Right. So it doesn't always have to be the power organizationally on paper. Right. So whether it's, and sometimes it's not the pastor, it's not the congregation, it's a couple of elders that run the show and appoint all the other elders. Right. So this can happen anywhere, but is the power balanced? Is the power distributed? And can the power be checked if anybody is trying to take too much? At any point that it's unchecked or it's concentrated, even if that's at the congregational level, it does become abuse of someone.
I think there also comes a point, I've been in those situations where it's just a couple people, and I've had some situations where, in doing my job, there's been, try not to get too specific, there's just been people who will email or, people who will say certain things and be like, oh, well, if you guys will continue to allow this, then we're not going to do this. We're not going to go anymore. And what I always say to anytime that situation comes up is 9 times out of 10, it's a minority of people. It's not a majority. Most people don't care about most of that stuff. They're just like, yeah, I don't. What does it matter? But it's a minority of people, and they're the loudest. That's the only thing. They're just loud. They're just the ones speaking out. They're just the ones pushing things, and the pastors and leaders tend to be afraid that they're going to recruit other people, or that because they're so loud that it's other people who are. There's a lot of people in on that, because they'll even say, oh, everybody feels the same way, which they don't.
Yeah, everybody's been saying, or we've heard a lot of people saying, hey, can you name any of them? Could you bring them with you to have a conversation? Right now, again, though, that can be weaponized too.
Yeah.
Because there was a point where I was bringing concerns to a church that we did church discipline with. And I told the pastor, I said, hey, there's a lot of staff that's feeling this way. And he said, hey, bring me names, tell me names. And I said, unfortunately, I would love to, but we can't do that. Because if we bring you names, you have proven that you're going to discipline them, you're going to fire them, you're going to retaliate. So, and I remember telling the elder board when they asked for names too, I said, if you will assure us that no one will be retaliated against in writing for bringing forward these allegations, then I'll have you 60 people tomorrow. And they couldn't do it, right? Yeah. So we have to be careful about that too. If you're in power, it's hard to say who are all these people, right?
Yeah.
So it's a dance. It's delicate there. But again, this is a great reminder. Spiritual abuse and unchecked power, unbalanced power, concentrated power, it can happen. It doesn't have to always be church staff. It's not always the senior pastor doing the abuse, right?
Yeah.
That's easy for us to see. Okay, that's these really high-profile cases. But it's important that we have balanced power that can be checked. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. But it's important that we have balanced power that can be checked, which is why Scripture gives us multiple layers of power. Okay, you have elders, you have overseers, you have the people in the congregation, right? There's in the biblical model, anybody can be checked at any time.
Yeah.
Okay. But even with the biblical model, if we start moving off of that just a little bit, it can become abusive, right?
Yeah.
So anything else on the power? Because I think that's good. It's a good reminder that it's not just top church staff. It's not just top down. That's not always where the power resides. Anything else on the power issue that you guys want to talk about?
I was kind of thinking about how it's a mentality that we have to be careful of, in the fact that while you may hold some sense of power, whatever position you're in, we need to switch that word power to where it's more of, I'm a manager, I'm a leader, I'm a facilitator, I'm a representative. Like, why can't we look at it in that instance? And then that way, to me, it kind of removes the abuse of being the one that's, somebody has to be the bottom line, the last say, or make a decision. We have to have those people for things to function properly. correctly. I mean, we have leaders, we have managers, we have those things. But when it becomes something that is abused, of course, that is the problem. And so, why do we have to have such a power play? And it's a very it's a very mental mentality thing.
Well, I think a lot of this shifted, and the power issue's always been here, right? But it looks different today because over the last 40 or so years, we have really started talking about leadership above all else in church circles.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would agree with that.
So in pastoral circles and staff circles, and even in volunteer leadership pipelines in churches, we talk a lot about leadership. I hear more about leadership in churches today than I hear about discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I hear more about what John Maxwell says about leadership than I hear about what Jesus said about
There's
discipleship.
a lot of books written.
Okay. And I appreciate so much of the work that John Maxwell has done.
Yeah.
But I don't care about what John Maxwell said about leadership if it gets in the way of what Jesus said about discipleship. Okay.
I imagine he'd probably say the same thing to you.
I think he would. At the same time, we hear more about leadership than we hear about stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
When we hear about stewardship, it is almost always through the lens of finances.
Always.
Biblical stewardship is so much more than finances.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what you're talking about, Vicki. I'm managing something that's not mine. I'm managing something I have to give a report to the master over.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stewarding something that if I'm not stewarding it well, the people I'm stewarding it to serve will say, you no longer get to steward it, right? The problem is a lot of church leaders today don't feel like they're stewards. They feel like they are managers from a leadership position. I'm a CEO. The buck stops with me, right? I get to do this. People don't get to question. And if you question, somebody, I'm going to butcher this, not remember it specifically, but there was a person who put a post out last week, and they put it, I think it was on Facebook where I saw it, and they were just talking about, if you have, or maybe it was on Threads and not Facebook, but it was basically if you're questioning the vision for the house that your pastor set, you're the problem. Mm-hmm. And all I could think about was, when did one pastor start setting the vision for the whole house of a gathering? That's not a biblical thing. That's a leadership thing, okay? And I'm a leadership coach, so it's, hey, I'm casting vision for this organization. Jesus didn't tell pastors to cast vision.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't tell prophets to cast vision, right? Now, while there are some vision casting elements, it's, hey, if we're all part of a gathering, we're all supposed to be a part of this gathering. Multiple people are supposed to prophesy every week. Multiple people are supposed to lead. We're all supposed to be using our fivefold ministry gifts and playing those roles. So when you have one person who says, I'm the CEO leader, well, then they can say, I set the vision for this house. And if you can't get behind it, you need to find another house, right? When the reality is, Jesus never told pastors, there's a way for you to jettison sheep.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's not really, that's not the process. There are ways that we discipline sheep, right? And you may need to remove a sheep from the sheep pen for discipline reasons. You don't remove them because they question your vision, because it's not about your vision. It's about the Great Commission, the vision we've already been given.
And that's, I was going to bring that up too, is you've got some pastors, even specific denominations that will do this, and the pastor is the end all, the ultimate authority, and that is an issue. If you question the pastor in any way, I've seen. Obviously, I think a lot of people have seen like the reels and the TikToks of certain pastors, and I tend to watch them because I didn't grow up in a church like that, but I was very close to people who did. And you'll see pastors who will call like somebody on stage and say, you need to bark like a dog in front of everybody. And they'll do it. And if they don't do it, they are not heeding the authority in their lives, which is
you're not honoring the authority God's put over you.
Right. And that's super dangerous too, because that's that unchecked power. And it's probably one of the worst forms of unchecked power I've ever seen.
Yeah. So you'll know part of this because you know a little bit of the story. Gosh, I just lost where I was going with that. I'll find it. I'll find it and cut this part out. What were we talking about?
The unchecked power of pastors and churches.
Oh, yeah. So, Shawn, you'll know the story just because you know kind of where this happened. But I remember a situation where there was a staffing issue at a specific campus of a larger mega church kind of in our area, right? And there were people who were coming to me and saying, hey, there's stuff that's happening that doesn't seem right. It seems like there's deception.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there may be flat out lies. Okay. There's issues here. But we believe we can work it out because the senior pastor, the head honcho, is coming to our campus to set the record straight. He's going to let us know what really happened here. Okay. He gets up, he gets on stage, he gives a spiel that is obviously deceptive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it doesn't add up. And because it doesn't add up, people are coming afterwards to ask questions. Okay. And I heard this from multiple people. I heard from multiple people who said this is what the pastor told them, and more people who said this is what his handler, because he had some handlers with him, told them. Okay. At least 2 handlers that I have been able to basically look at the evidence and say for sure they did this. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the pastor told multiple people when they asked questions, instead of answering the question, hey, what really happened here? Can you answer this question? Yes or no? He answered with a question. It was, do you trust me?
Yeah.
If you trust me, you don't have to answer that. You don't have to ask that question.
Yeah.
Do you trust that God put me as the pastor here?
Well, it's deflecting onto the person.
It's very deflecting. What it does is if you trust me, you don't have to ask. If you trust God, you don't have to ask. So if you keep asking, you don't trust God and you don't trust the person God put
Mm-hmm.
over you, right? When scripturally, we should be able to ask questions. Think about it. David would have never gotten to the point of repentance he got to if Nathan couldn't say, hey, let me tell you a story about this guy who stole a sheep. Oh, by the way, it was you.
Yeah. And that was a dangerous story to tell a king because, in fact, I could be wrong, but if I remember right, David was at the point of like, he was like, we're going to go kill this person who did this. And if Nathan hadn't been, and if Nathan had pointed out from the beginning it was you, he was in danger of being killed too.
He could have lost his life for doing that.
Absolutely.
Right? So we see biblically where people were able to check power even when it was scary, right? But again, it wasn't just this pastor. There were 2 other handlers, one who was on staff and one who was on the elder board who were there. And again, none of this is a single testimony. With each handler and with the pastor, it's multiple sets of testimony that I've heard from people where they asked similar questions. And both handlers did the same thing. Do you trust pastor? Fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you trust pastor, you don't have to ask that question.
well-
Do you trust that God put him as the pastor over this house? Right? And by doing that, they were abusing spiritual power.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not just unchecked power. It's not just concentrated power. There's an abuse at times of over-spiritualizing power.
Mm-hmm.
God put this person in authority. So if you question this person, you're questioning God. Well, it's no. God didn't put this person in authority. God put this person in the greatest serving role as the pastor, the shepherd to the sheep.
And even if you look at it as God put him in authority, which I can see how people would look at it that way. Yeah, he put him in authority over the sheep and whatever. That doesn't mean everything he does is correct. And that doesn't mean he's infallible. That he's not Jesus.
No, he's
I
a
mean,
human being.
He's going to make mistakes and that's
Not
okay.
perfect.
Well, let's think about 1 Timothy, right? Let's think about 1 Timothy. What does 1 Timothy say about when we have to correct a church leader, someone with spiritual authority over the flock? It says if we have to correct that church leader, to do it in front of everyone so that there will be fear for other people doing it.
Yeah, because this person or people or whomever could have asked this question maybe on a one-on-one, conversation. And so what if they had said, well, no, I don't trust my pastor then. I'm asking the question, obviously, So what would have happened in that scenario? You think, well, okay, well, you can leave. You can leave the church or whatever and blah, blah, blah. So then they're in that position. Or if they go along with it and go, well, now, wait, I guess I shouldn't question. So now we're in a whole nother power play of deception. So like this person is now questioning themselves, which is really bad.
Yeah. Well, and when the people left, many of them were villainized. Because what do you do if a person does leave after that and people ask, why did this person leave? They were here every week for years. Why would they leave? That really bothers us. Well, they left because they had a heart issue where they couldn't follow the leadership. They just couldn't submit to the leadership that God has ordained in this church.
To the person who or people who questioned.
It's just more versions of Darvo, which we're going to do a whole episode on Darvo soon, because once you see that, people lose, these manipulators lose their power. Right. But that realistically, here's what should have happened. Okay. But this is hard for us when we want to honor our leaders. We want to submit to the leaders and authority that God's put over us. We want to honor people. Now, I'm a little different because I've been on church staff for so long and I've been a pastor for so long that for me, when someone plays that power card, it's I am just as called as you.
Mm-hmm.
And although we play different roles, when it comes to morality questions, when it comes to truthful questions, you have no more authority than I do. I have the same Holy Spirit in me that you have. So I will be honoring. But if I had asked that question, and it would help if more church parishioners could do this, but it feels uncomfortable. And it's why we don't do it. It feels very uncomfortable. It feels sinful, okay? But it's not. When you have someone ask you a question like that, hey, you asked me a question, but instead of answering it, I'm just going to say, hey, do you trust me? Because if you trust me, you don't have to ask that question. Then I would say, I did trust you enough to ask you the question and believe what you told me. But if you refuse to answer the question, it tells me I don't have a reason to trust you right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Asking the question is not a sign of dishonor. Asking the question is not a sign of mistrust. You answering the question is not a sign of you lying. But when you refuse to answer the question and say it's dishonoring that I even asked it, that's unbiblical. That's deceptive. So now, I hate to say it, but now that you ask that question, the moment you ask that question, no, from this moment forward, I don't trust you until you give me the information that I've asked for. Yeah. Because that is a manipulative way to deflect from answering a question, okay? No one who has the truth is going to say, if you trust me, you don't have to ask that question. They might say, hey, there's things I can't tell you, and I'm going to have to ask you to trust me right now because I can't tell you. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why can't you tell me? Well, it's a clearance issue because I work at a place with Q clearance and I can't share that. Okay, I get that, right? Yeah. If the pastor says, you're going to have to trust me, I can't tell you that issue. Why can't you tell me that issue? Well, there's some HR laws and stuff like that if I tell you the specifics, it's going to get us into trouble. Okay, well then what can you tell me to alleviate this concern, right? Mm-hmm. So if they give you specific reasons, it's not that bad. But if they just say, if you trust me, you don't have to ask, that's like a husband or a wife that's cheating, right? So think about that, Shawn. That would be like me cheating on Candace and her going, hey, I've seen some red flags. I've seen some concerns. Can I look at your text messages?
Yeah.
Who have you been text messaging? Can I look at your messages? Baby, if you trusted me, if you really loved me, you wouldn't even have to ask that question.
Yeah.
Right? No. If she asks, I'm going to go, absolutely, you can look at my text messages.
Yeah.
Because 100%. You're the only, there's nothing there that I'm concerned about. You're the only woman that I love, and I want you to know, look at these text messages because I'm telling people how much I love you and everything else, right? If you're on the side of truth, you want to get the truth out.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Any
time in life where we say, if you trust me, love me, fill in the blank, you don't have to ask that question, it is manipulative, it's abusive, and it's trying to make the other person the villain, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
100% is.
I get that. I've even taken a step further even to the ridiculous. And it sounds even ridiculous just saying it, but I've been told myself, but I've heard it a lot that, you remember the story, I think it was Elijah in the Old Testament where the teenagers were making fun of him for being bald and then bears came out and ate them. Yep. I've heard it said, like, you don't question God's anointed because look what happened when somebody did not honor God's chosen. And so be careful. That's a whole new level. That's like emotional, spiritual. Because if, when people, believe that, that's like, God's going to kill me if I question you, which it sounds ridiculous saying it. And people are going to be listening like, oh, that never happens. It does happen.
And in the moment, it really does cause fear and wonder. I mean, I've had people tell us with this podcast, I've had people tell us online, hey, you better be careful. Mm-hmm. You better be careful. Think about what God did to Elijah. Yeah. Or think about what God did to those kids. You'd better be careful questioning the man of God. And I'm like, well, I'm still here.
Yeah.
There's been no lightning. There's been no bears. So, wisdom is proven right by its results.
Yep.
In the Old Testament, they cast a lot of lots. It feels like the lots have been cast. The witnesses are here. That should also mean there's validity to what we're saying.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't like that because that doesn't produce extra honor. This idea of honoring the man of God is so much more of an Old Testament concept than a New Testament concept anyway, that pastors, church staff, and church leaders in the New Covenant, there's no man of God that you need to honor. There are different levels of servants, Jesus said in this economy of leadership, in this economy of relationship, my people don't lord leadership over one another. Period.
Well, and people don't understand what honor is. They think honor is falling in line and doing exactly everything that a leader says or a person says, and never questioning it unless it's illegal. Like if your pastor said, go murder this person, well, you wouldn't think, well, I'm not honoring him if I don't do it. You'd be like, okay, that's too far. But people are taught the wrong things about honor. They're just like, that means you just shut up and you listen, you do everything I say.
Well, think about, what was the dude's name back in the 80s? The don't drink the Kool-Aid guy.
Oh, yeah.
Who was that cult leader? Was it Jim Jones?
Jim Jones.
Yeah.
Jim Jones.
I was just getting ready to say this is very cultish. If you're,
Yeah, well, Jim Jones literally had people, they'd moved all their people in this cult to this, city in another country. And when they were killing them, he had his people who were murdering other people in the flock congregation,
there
the cult.
are people who do
Because they
that.
said they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't drink the Kool-Aid and they forced them to.
Yeah. Right. So it was, it does get to that point if we don't question.
Yeah.
When the reality is the only leader that has the right to say, don't question me, is God, right? Everybody else we're supposed to question, but even think about this all throughout Scripture. And you heard me preach a sermon on this yesterday, but you look at David in the Psalms, you look at Jeremiah, you look at Job, you look at Jonah. There's all kinds of people. Even Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which was a quote from David in the Psalms, right? The Bible is full of people who question God, and God didn't strike them down when they asked questions. He gave answers.
Sometimes it was answers they didn't like, but he gave them.
Sometimes to Job, it was like, I'll give you some answers. You aren't ready for these answers.
Yeah.
Right? But we see a history of even God is okay with us asking these questions. But we have leaders who say, if you ask questions, that's totally dishonoring. All of those guys, all of those are abuses of power. Yeah. I love the way that Tim Ross says it. He says, if you want to know what abuse is, the best way to look at what abuse is abnormal use. And I believe that's part of the etymology of the word, abnormal use. Well, in the Christian economy, lording your leadership or authority over someone else is abnormal use. We submit to one another is what Scripture says. We serve one another. So if you have a concern, you have a question, you're not sure if what we're doing is above board and above reproach, then we're going to do everything we can to serve you and make you feel better about it. We're going to give you all that information because what are we called to do? Submit to one another. And if you look at the New Testament, man, it is filled with love one another's and submit to one another's, care for one another's. How do we do this Christian life well? We one another with one another. That's what we do, right? So again, anytime you see hints or evidence or breadcrumbs of someone lording their power over other people, saying don't question it, or trying to hold on to power or trying to grab more power, that is not Jesus. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. None of it is power, authority, or leadership.
Yep.
Right? Anything else on power that we missed? Because this has been a good discussion. This takes on a lot of different forms in church world.
Yeah. I was telling you before the podcast, there's a church that I'm very familiar with, connected with, not the one I go to now, that kind of goes back to what you said in 1 Timothy.
Just so people know, it's not even in this area. You're connected to it through other people.
Yeah. It's like you were saying, 1 Timothy, when you call out a leader, do it publicly, and in a church business meeting that had nothing to do with, it shouldn't have been called in the first place, is basically the pastor telling somebody's confidential story and trying to justify why he fired them unjustly, in my opinion, but that's not really part of the story. One of the ministry directors stood up and called him out on some unbiblical practices and preaching and teachings that he was giving, and he turned around in front of everybody and told her, "I want your resignation right here, right now." And since then, it's just been a storm of chaos there. And with that pastor who I've known, not all my life or anything like that, but I've known him, and the whole thing is just a huge mess. But anyways, it's power that's gotten out of control to the point where she questioned him in front of everybody instead of trying to defend himself. Like if he was preaching biblically, he could have said, "Show me what I've been doing that's unbiblical, right here. If you want to do this, let's do this.
And once you can show me that, how can we correct it?"
Right. Instead, he's like, "I want you not." He didn't say you're fired. He said, "I want you to resign right here, right now, in front of everybody."
Not you're wrong, not you're in sin. You question me in front of everyone, so now I demand your resignation.
And this is not a big church. It's not a mega church. It's a medium-sized church. It's larger than the average, but it's not a big church.
But that was the pastor who has authority, who has a different kind of cachet than a regular parishioner or a regular staff member, right? And that was an abuse of authority. Instead of answering the question in a forum where the question could be asked, it was, "No, you questioned me. Now you need to leave."
Yeah. Well, and it goes a little bit beyond that, and I won't go into too many details, but it got to a point where the 5 out of 6 board members or something like that went into a meeting intent on calling for a vote of no confidence because it's a congregation-led body. And they came out of the meeting, which nobody knows what happened in there, and none of them called for that vote. There was something that was done and said in that meeting that shut down every single one of those board members. And they're people that I've known personally that are good people who, don't usually just follow like that. So all that to say is this abuse of power can go, it can get crazy, and it can be very detrimental, not to just a church, a building, an organization, but to the people who go there. And, we need to watch out for that in big churches and in small churches.
Yeah, for sure. I want to go back to the 1 Timothy 5 thing because we mentioned it a couple of times. I want to go to the scripture so people can hear it, right? Because there is such a tension here. Also, this is a good reminder of it doesn't matter what translation of the Bible you're reading from. I'm going to read from the NLT here, and I'm going to have to bring attention to what I think is a really bad translation editing choice. Okay, but the same thing exists in the ESV and the NIV. This blows people's minds. It makes them really mad. Okay, the Bible, as the way it was written, you can believe that the Bible is inerrant, right? But any version of the Bible that we have in a language that's not Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, that's not the original language, there are translators and editors that had to make choices, okay? And those translators and editors are not without error. And that's why sometimes we have to look and say, this translation doesn't do as good of a job as this translation, because sometimes there is error there. So I'm going to give that as well. It's a good example. I mean, sometimes when I say that, when I talk about editors and translators and choices, people think I'm saying that the Bible's not inerrant, which is not what I'm saying at all in that moment. What I'm saying is when we're making these translation choices, we just have to know what were they put together for. Like, for instance, with the ESV, it's going to be a very complementarian word choice everywhere you go, right? But let's look at this one, 1 Timothy 5:17, and we're going to read through 20, okay? 1 Timothy 5:17, elders who do their work well, and this isn't just pastors, but it's church elders, okay? Elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well. And then there's that little footnote, because if you go to the footnote, the actual translation in almost every scripture is worthy of double honor. Okay. We've talked about double honor and what that means. It's not always about pay. But when you say paid well, it totally changes the meaning of this text, right? But a church elder should be worthy of double honor. And that can affect pay, right? But we have to be very careful with that. That is not the translation. Should be paid well is not the translation, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching, okay? And that's, really talking about people sharing the gospel, okay? For the scripture says, you must not muzzle an ox and keep it from eating as it treads out grain. And in another place, those who work deserve their pay, okay? Those who work deserve to eat, right? So we're looking at, where did that scripture come from? Those who work deserve to eat. So we need to make sure that our church elders are taken care of, that they're not going without because they're serving the church. They're not able to take care of their family or feed themselves or have a house or live indoors or any of that because they're preaching the gospel.
Right.
Okay. Now, that is used a lot by people in power to say, you got to pay us well and we got to be professional Christians. Okay.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, there were hardly no professional Christians at this time. Nobody was making a full-time living in the first century Christendom off of being a church leader. So that's not what it was talking about. So do we take care of our church leaders? Yes. This doesn't mean that we pay church leaders necessarily full-time or that that's the biblical response for it. I think it's fine for church leaders to be paid full-time. I just think that's a poor biblical foundation to say they have to be.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? But it starts 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18 is talking about us taking care of our elders and not abusing them. Okay. So this is anti-spiritual abuse. It's make sure that you're not just taking and taking and taking from those who are supposed to serve you. 1 Timothy 5, 17, elders who do their work well, or sorry, we've already done that one. So we'll go down to 19 after it talks about that. Do not listen to an accusation against an elder unless it's confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. That is used, it's weaponized a lot, okay? Because let's say you have a sexual assault allegation, an SA allegation, and someone comes forward and says this happened. Well, you got to bring 2 or 3 witnesses. Well, in SA cases, especially when you go to the nth degree of those, there's usually not a witness, okay?
Usually not, yeah.
But think about this. Does that just mean eyewitnesses? When we go to court and we have cases like that, do we say we can't try them because there was no witness? No, because there's evidence that witnesses, there's circumstantial witnesses, there's character witnesses. So the witnesses aren't necessarily to what happened. The witnesses are to the response and to the allegation.
Yeah.
Okay. But don't listen to an accusation against an elder unless it's confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. So we got to have other people saying there's validity to this. We need to check this out. Okay. It can't just be one person crying wolf. But here's the very next verse. Those who sin, talking about church elders, that's the context here. Those who sin should be reprimanded in front of the whole church, the whole gathering. This will serve as a strong warning to others. And then Paul finishes that section. I solemnly command you in the presence of God and Christ Jesus and the highest angels to obey these instructions without taking sides or showing favoritism to anyone. That is Paul saying, you got to go after truth and not protecting the people that you like.
Yeah.
Right? That's what this is. So yes, it does not mean that honor does not mean that we don't challenge a church leader. When there's validity to it and there's witnesses that say there's validity to it and there's evidence that says there's validity to it, honor is actually saying in front of everyone, here's the problem. You need to repent. We need to make this right.
Yeah.
It's actually a dishonor to hide it. It's a dishonor to the kingdom. It's a dishonor to Christ. It's a dishonor to the people they've hurt if we hide it, right? So yes, we honor elders who do their work well, but we also hold to account and rebuke elders who are doing dangerous things. We've got to be able to hold both of those in tension.
Yeah, I agree.
So anything else on power before we move on from that? There's so many nuances to power abuse.
I mean, you could probably go for days on stories like that. So,
all right, well, let's talk about the second part of this formula. Power plus deception. Okay. Can you have spiritual abuse, which is power issues? Yes. But when you pair it with deception, spiritual abuse is 100% coming.
Yeah.
Right? It's 100% coming, and it's going to become systemic. Once you have power plus deception, it becomes systemic, and it's going to happen not just with one person, it's going to happen with more people as it grows, okay? Because you have people who are underneath the person with power who are carving out power for themselves that can't be checked from those below them, okay?
Yeah.
So let's think about deception. The funny thing about deception, people tend to think that deception means lying, okay? And deception does not mean lying. I can deceive you while telling you the truth. All right. But I'm not telling you the truth to get you to do the right thing or have the right idea. I'm trying to use the truth to deceive you. Think about, when we're thinking about like this idea of the enemy and the devil, right? When you look at the devil in scripture, you look at the serpent, you look at different pictures of this. He never came out. It said he was crafty and wise. He never came out and just said flat out lies because people would get that. Think about the serpent talking to Eve. It was, did God really say you would die? right? There was truth in what he was saying, but it was twisted.
Yeah.
It was deceptive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I have heard church leaders, I've been in rooms where they're like, where I said, hey, that's not honest. What we just told people is not honest. We spun that story. And their defense was, we didn't technically lie. We said it this way specifically so that it wasn't technically a lie. So I'll give you an example of this. You have a church staff member who's been around for a long time. They all of a sudden disappear. Okay. And it's, so Shawn, I'll use you as an example. Hey, we just wanted to make the announcement, this is Shawn's last day on staff. And, we really appreciate everything Shawn has done. He's been such a blessing here. Shawn, your ministry has been such a blessing. We're so grateful for you. But it's become clear in recent days to Shawn and his family that the Lord is calling him somewhere else. And as he embarks on this next season, we want to pray for him. We ask you that you pray for him. You'll send him a message encouraging him. And Shawn, we just want to pray for you real quick. Now, notice what just happened. Shawn didn't get to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But have you heard something like that probably 20 plus times in church already?
I've heard that word for word said to me. I mean, in fact, there was one church I was a part of that the pastor, after he did that, he messaged me and wanted me to come back to the church so they could honor me publicly in front of the church and take up an offering for my family. Yeah. And I'm like, no,
not
thanks.
Tell them you had been fired, but
Yeah.
if you came in, it would make it look good, right?
Yeah.
So here's a very kind of normal story, true story behind that. Yes, it has become very clear to Shawn that the Lord is calling him somewhere else. That is 100% true.
Yeah.
But it became clear to him the Lord was calling him somewhere else because we fired him.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't say, and again, maybe there was a reason for the firing, maybe there wasn't, right? But when we don't say we fired him, but we believe in his ministry going forward, that invites questions. So we just say it's become very clear. We say all these things. We love him. We honor him. We're grateful for what he did. All those things can be true.
Yeah.
But what you're deceiving people with is you're not saying at the same time, we don't think he's the right fit right now.
Yeah.
Right. Because that again invites questions. Did y'all take care of his family? Did y'all give him every opportunity to fix it? What was the issue? Was the issue an actual performance issue? Was it a sin issue? Or was it a you didn't like him issue? Was it a he didn't line up with the vision of this house issue? Because then people start asking, well, didn't God set the vision of the house? Right. There's all kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So little things like that, they don't seem terrible because even if people hear them, they go, well, I get it. They didn't technically lie. Right. Not technically lying. Almost every time you have to say, I didn't technically lie, you were deceptive. Okay.
Yeah.
I've taught my kids this since they were little. I don't care if you technically told me the truth. There's no loopholes with lying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you are trying to deceive me, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
It's pushing a specific narrative to their benefit, and that's deception.
I look at it.
100%.
I look at it as like if you have a pathway, you're trying to push somebody towards the wrong path. That's what deception ultimately does. It pushes you down the wrong, either wrong thinking or wrong view on things. I mean, it's the view
I'm trying
you want,
to get you to a different conclusion than you would come to if I told you the flat out honest truth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And the reason why I use that example is because that's one that most people will resonate with. Because if you've ever heard someone leave a church, you've heard that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now here's the difference when someone's being honest, because sometimes that is pretty honest, but when it's honest, you don't have to hide it. When it's honest, you say, hey, we love what Shawn's been doing. Unfortunately, today's going to be Shawn's last day. Him and his family have been called somewhere else. And a couple of weeks ago, he came into my office and let me know he's been praying about this. And he really felt like the Lord is calling him to take this job. And I was surprised and a little heartbroken, but excited for Shawn.
And usually they'll give that person a chance to talk. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to? Yeah, I've heard that. That's how I know it's honest, is when I've heard, do you want to come up here and say anything? Sometimes it's like, no, I'm good. Or sometimes like, yeah, I'm just really glad that, and it's usually good stuff. I'm glad to have been here and love you guys and whatever. But it's always deceptive, almost always deceptive when they don't let them have
And
a
that's
chance.
part of the power play that comes into it too. 'Cause
Exactly.
we're completely controlling the situation.
Well, so this was years ago now, but I got fired from a position and didn't have to leave. It was we're going to put you in another position. Literally, it's quoted to me, we're going to put you in another position where you don't have influence. we're going to hide you,
Yeah.
was the quote. But if you don't tell anybody, we're going to find a place to put you. We're going to pay you the same. We're going to make it look like a promotion. And they really did. They did all the work,
Mhm.
right? And they said all the things. They didn't technically lie, but they were highly deceptive. But here was the thing, man. I was in student ministry at the time. I get done preaching. And my boss comes out to say all these flowery, nice things, all these incredible things. He's got the mic. I don't get to talk at all,
Mhm.
right? And it's, here's what we're going to do. Here's what's going to happen. If you have any questions, ask me. If you have any questions, ask this person. It wasn't, if you have any questions, ask Jeff, right?
Yeah.
And I had a narrative that if I didn't say that narrative, I lost my job and my ability to take care of my wife and my kids tomorrow.
My thing is too, there are people hearing that and they're going, well, wait a minute. Jeff's been doing a great job. Why are we moving him? So,
Or
you know,
you have kids and parents who are like, we've had conversations with you and you were committed here. I feel like you lied to me.
Yeah.
And I can't say anything.
right. And you have to lie again, really.
Yeah. Well, is the
You know what I'm
greatest
saying?
regret
Like,
I've ever
or-
had in ministry. I
Yeah.
had to tell a lot of lies to keep up with theirs.
Right.
So they were like, we didn't technically lie. Well, I had to lie to
Yeah.
keep up with your lies,
You
right?
told me I had to.
But at the same time, there were people who were asking me, hey, are you really okay? Because you look so emotional up there. Well, I'm emotional because the same guy who fired me and said, hey, I was in my quiet time this morning. I was praying about it and God told me to fire you. There's no reason, but God told me to fire you. So the same person that said that, the same person that said all this, the same person that threatened if you tell anybody the truth, will fire you and your wife immediately, right? So all of this, that same person's up there talking about how much they love me,
Mhm.
talking about how good of a job I've done, talking about how you should be so grateful and everything else. And it's like, this feels like you're lying through your teeth to anyone who knows the truth,
Yeah.
but it's spin, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Because you did do a great job
and
and people did love you there. I mean, it's
I think that's true,
Yeah.
but at the same time, just tell people the truth, man. Hey, we decided this is not a good fit for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why do we not do that?
Or-
Because when I say that, I have to answer for that to people who have questions.
Right. But why do we even have to make it a public thing like that anyway? Like to that extent? I mean,
Because when people leave, we want a lot of times that deception starts with, hey, if we can do this the right way, we'll get people more bought into what we're doing and trust us even more through this person leaving. So like with Shawn, your example, I gave, yours was the original example where I used you was totally false. Like we just made that up on the fly.
Yeah.
But then you gave a story and said, I had something very similar happen. I gave a story, but in your story, you said, hey, I was fired. And then they asked me if I would come back in and let them honor me so it would look good.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why we can actually get people more bought in and trust us more through this. But it doesn't always happen in that way. Sometimes it's just the way we're making an announcement to the church in an email or
mhm.
from the stage, we twist it just a little bit. I call it spin. Okay. We spin it just a little bit so it sounds really good. And it keeps people from asking the questions they would normally ask. Because again, it's what you said, Shawn. Deception is when you say things that are true in such a way that it leads people to a conclusion that's not.
Yeah.
Right? I'm trying to lead you to a conclusion that is not true without technically lying. Okay? So that's what I'm doing. Well, there's a lot of deceptions. You can have deception in those emails, those church announcements. Here's a great place where a lot of deception happens. Annual reports. Annual reports have become notorious for churches. We don't give a lot of detail. What we give you is we're going to give you a pie chart with about 5 slices, if you're lucky. And then what are we going to do? We're going to tell you about all the money that came in for ministry. And then we're going to tell you about stories of life change from each ministry. Because you can't really ask questions with stories, right? But it's deceptive in how much money was spent on these things. Let's tell you about missions. Here's the percentage that we spent on missions, right? And let's tell you these stories about missions. Now, it's deceptive, though, that we're not telling you that a lot of missions, it wasn't international missions or anything like that. It was paying it to our network partners and, other stuff like that. That's not really missions, okay? We don't tell you what people, what was paid toward like worship production and staffing. We just kind of hide it out in all these places, right? That it's deceptive. There is a very deceptive way those things are put together. And Shawn, as a marketer who's been in church and everything else, you know how to put the pie chart and stories together in a way that people don't ask questions about.
Yeah. And, you know, actually, the funny thing is it became kind of a joke in certain circles of certain meetings where the pastor would get up and he would just throw out these random numbers. Like one time for Easter,
Pastor math.
Yeah, pastor math. Like we had you know, almost 200,000 people join us online. We nowhere near it, nowhere even close to it, and it just kind of became a joke. We don't know where he comes up with that, but it sounds great, so we'll just leave it. And no, there's no correction in it. There's no, and it's same thing with numbers. Like we raised this much money, but on the back end, I saw the amounts, and I'm like, we not even half that. But we're telling people we raise this much money, trying to get them to give more money, or trying to get them to do a certain action, or trying to get them to whatever it is we want them to do. And whether it was an accident, like, oh, he just doesn't know the numbers. I mean, ask somebody or something, you know.
Usually you don't throw out specific numbers on accident. You made a choice to make something up.
Yeah, or correct it later. Like, hey, I said we had 100,000. Really, we had like 50, and that's still a huge number. Let's, you know, that's great. We're excited about it. You know.
Yeah, I got that number wrong.
Yeah,
that's
not a big deal. But
so
yeah.
I
think
remember
that's a form of deception, is to not correct even mistakes. Like if you make a mistake and you don't correct it, just to keep the perception. Well, he didn't know he was lying. It was a mistake. Well, you didn't correct it.
Okay. But when you throw out a specific number, we had 200,000 people with us for Easter. Okay. That's not a mistake. You chose that number with no evidence. So when we throw in numbers, because we'll throw them, you know, sometimes of, hey, here's how many people we were able to reach. Here's how many unique accounts we were able to reach. Those always come before those numbers get posted. They come from me doing calculations from the screenshots off of all of our different platforms, social media platforms and all that. If somebody asks, I can show them how we got that number. And in certain places where we have to estimate how we got that estimation, it's a good faith estimation based on what we have. Because sometimes, for instance, like if we're doing a 90-day deal, we got to do an estimation because not all social media platforms will show us 90 days. Some will only show us 60. Most show us 90. So if I'm looking at a 90-day snapshot, it's going to be different than a month.
Well, and for me at a church, just from a marketing standpoint, I also do the online campus stuff. And I something that I would say is, you know, if you want to gauge, and this is mostly for back end purposes, for, you know, like how much should we focus on these things? Let's do a 1.7 multiplier, meaning that when somebody's watching service online, there is a statistically higher chance that there's going to be multiple people in the room watching with them. So we do this multiplier, not so we can say, look at us, this is how many numbers we have, but say this platform is doing this much better than this platform if we look at these kinds of numbers. So we need to focus on these areas. For me as a marketer, that's what I would do.
And that's why that stuff was started. But then you have a lot of pastors who said that multiplier is not enough. It was probably like 2.5 people watching with them. Let's put that multiplier on everything. And then when we turn in our numbers to the denomination, or we turn in our numbers to outreach.com to try to get on the top 100 list, or we're sharing the numbers in our annual report, we're counting the attendance from multiplying by 2.5 or 3 or 3.5 every view we had online. Now, let's not even talk about the fact that a lot of those views were 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. But now we're saying all these people attended. Why? Because it makes it look like we're more successful than we are and people give. But that's manipulative. People are giving because you got them to a different conclusion than they would have gotten to with the actual information.
Yeah. And that's, for me, that's the biggest thing. Like I used it from a marketing standpoint. I would parse out the 3 seconds, the 10 seconds, the 1 minute and beyond, you know, and I go in through like who dropped off when. I know this might be getting too technical, but the point is, we would look at these, and from my perspective, it was like, okay, what do we need to do? How do we need to reach people, and who do we need to care for, and whatever, where do we need to focus our time and energy? Whereas, like you said, they would put these big multipliers on saying, we have all of these people that we're doing so great. Now we need, you know, because of this, we need to do this more, and whatever the case is.
So things like the multipliers for online views were created, and they were designed to better care for people.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
But then they were used to tell a manipulative, spun story.
Yep.
Right? And that's where deception comes in. Because, again, most deception doesn't start out with we're trying to hurt people. it starts with ego. We're trying to look good.
Yeah.
We're trying to look better than we were. We don't want people to think bad about us because we fired someone.
Yeah.
So we spin the story to make it look like God called them somewhere else.
Yeah.
We don't want people to think bad about us and tell them we actually went slightly backwards this year when we could, tell them by telling them the truth, by using this multiplier and all this stuff, we had this many people and we grew, or look how much we grew because we started 2 prison campuses, or something like that. Right. A lot of the growth tends to be manufactured if we're not sharing details, right?
Well, and something to point out there is sometimes, like in the position I was in, it would have benefited me to inflate those numbers to tell the leadership because it would have made me look better. They wouldn't have known any different. They don't know how to look for that stuff. They know what I tell them. So there also is a different level of accountability on even just staff people. But that also comes from, some other pressures and stuff that might come in.
Hey, Disruptors. My name's Shawn Reece, one of the hosts of the Church Disrupted podcast. If you have enjoyed what we're doing here on the podcast, we'd love for you to partner with us financially so that we can continue to help those who are healing, find community, and combat spiritual abuse. Whatever you can give, we are so grateful for your support.
So it's not always just the top leadership. Sometimes the top leadership's just spouting off stuff that they've gotten from people they trust.
A lot of times they get bad data.
Yeah.
Because so there becomes a fear. And I remember being on a church staff where this happened. There was a fear that if we gave them data they didn't like and truth they didn't like, that we were going to get in trouble. They were going to lose their cool. Yeah. So people started telling them things that weren't true. I remember telling my boss, one of the executive pastors at one point, I said, "Hey, I just got told by someone who's in leadership over me, I got told to lie to you guys."
Yeah.
And he said, "Don't technically lie, but don't tell them what you really did at your campus. Like, act like you did what everybody else did unless they ask you flat out." Well, why? I the thing that I did, I had permission to do. Well, there was somebody in leadership who didn't really like that idea and we didn't want to tell them. And so I remember telling this person, I said, "You're getting bad data because people are lying to you because they're scared of you." Right. And again, he didn't want to react to that. He didn't want to say, "Hey, how can we make people feel safer to tell us the truth?" Instead, all he wanted to know was, "Tell me who lied."
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm not going to do that. You'll fire them tomorrow, right? You might fire them before the end of the day. So I'm not going to tell you. Well, then I'm assuming you're lying. Okay, fire me if you want.
Yeah.
But I'm not. I'm just telling you.
Right.
Right. So, and I told him what I was told to lie about. I just didn't tell him who told me to lie. I think about, we've talked about miracle offerings before. We did a whole docu-series on miracle offerings last year. We're getting close to miracle offering season again. If you're not familiar with miracle offerings, you can go check out that video. Miracle offering season is predominantly October through the first half of December, although some churches start early September because you don't notice it quite as much. Feels like back to school, but it really is the last part of the year. But in those, I remember I'm having some church staff from a church that I was decently close to that would come to me and they would say, "Hey, this church just announced that for their miracle offering that they raised $2.2 million. But when I look at the documents that we have as staff, it looks like we brought in $1.5 million or $1.2 million, stuff like that."
Still
right?
Great.
And it was just still great. But then you start looking into it and they didn't technically lie, because they counted that miracle offering. They counted everything that came in that entire month as normal tithes and offerings as also the miracle offering.
Yeah.
And you just round up. It's that pastor math.
Yeah.
You just round up.
Exactly. But what you're telling people is, look how much was given. Now, next year, if you want to be a part, go ahead and start praying about what you need to sacrifice, right? And now you're leading people to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
And there's no reason to lie about that or be deceptive other than, well, we want the number to be higher than last year, whether it was or not, because we want to look good. So again, a lot of this deception is not because I want to hurt people. It's because of ego, right?
Yeah.
But when that deception gets in, even if it's for ego, it causes issues. Now, let's think about this. Are there any other ways that you guys, before we move forward, that you have felt deceived, seen deception in church that you want to talk about?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it happens all the time, and it happens from every level. As a volunteer, it's happened. As being on staff, leading somebody, I've been in similar situations. Like, you have to lie to somebody, or as a staff member, I've gotten in trouble for not deceiving. Like when I tell somebody like, hey, this is what I've been told. This is what I'm supposed to tell you. And I don't agree with it. But
because often you're given if anybody asks, this is what you're supposed to say.
yeah. And I've gotten, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have done, I don't know what the ethics are there, but I just tell people flat out if, for instance, one time I was a supervisor over somebody, they were 1 day late in paying their tithes. And then there's 2 offenses. They were 1 day late and they were 25 cents off. And I was told that if
25 cents off, I guarantee you, is because of a bonus.
It was, yeah. That and then they also no, that was just a math calculation. There was 3 infractions actually. I'm sorry. One was 25 cents off. One was they were a day late because they got paid on the 30th and their tithes automatically came out in the 1st or whatever. It was an automatic pay thing. And with that same one, they had gotten a bonus that since their tithes came out automatically, they noticed it a week later and paid that. And so they were off on their tithing amount.
They fixed it
before being approached, but it didn't matter because they were off when they first did it.
It's a 3 strikes, you're out. If you miss your tithe 3 times, you're fired.
But for this instance, since those 2, they were like, well, we'll give you some discretion, but if it's one more time, they're fired. And I had to tell them that. And I basically told them, I said, this is what they're saying. I said, I've seen what happened. Everybody knows what I don't think this is right. And that person was like, well, I'm going to go talk to them. I said, you're welcome to do that. And I got reprimanded. I got reprimanded for saying that I didn't agree with it. And I didn't deny it. But I'm like, because it's dumb. Like it's
first of all, just so y'all know, this isn't just a single church thing. This happens at a lot of churches. Yeah. This has happened in really small churches. You're expected, man. People are watching your tithe, and if you're a little bit off legalistically, then I mean, they can't take it out automatically because that's illegal. But if you don't do it,
they can't fire you, and that's very legal to fire you. It's legal for them to
separation of church and state. They can do it because it's part of their religion.
There was something in the news not too long ago. I won't go into detail, but that a church fired somebody.
It's Church Home in Seattle. I'll say it.
Yeah,
because it's public record. We don't say names unless it's public record. That's
I just
public
figured
record.
I'd let you do it, and that was a big deal. Like there was a lawsuit, there was all these kinds of things. Is it legal for them to fire me for not tithing and whatever?
And that lawsuit's still ongoing in Seattle. It's going to set precedents for others, because again, a normal nonprofit can't make you get back to them as an employee, but because of separation of church and state stuff, we let Christians get by with some crazy crap, simply because of separation of church and state. When as Christians, we got to be better, right? So think about like any other deceptions before. I'm going to give a couple of other examples, but anything, Vicki, that you can think of where you just felt deceived, or you've seen deception.
I mean, yes, but I can't like pinpoint something right now, like just a specific. But I mean, it's just an overall, like an encompassing thing of multiple things all at once. I think here's an example I think I can give. It's come to my front of my brain here. When they deflect and make it, your problem, not their problem. It's a really bad way to go about. It's the power play too, but it's just if in a volunteer role, because I've not been on staff, so the deception of. Because you're involved just enough that you see behind the scenes things.
See things that don't feel right, even though you can't say I can't say I know what's not right, but it doesn't feel right.
And you're also seeing things on the other side of it as a member of a congregation. And so it's really it becomes a really confusing place to be. Like you are pulled in lots of different directions. So it's already an internal spiritual battle anyway.
Because people that I trust, both on staff and that have left and all that, people I trust are telling different stories. So someone's lying.
Right. Yeah. And just even like in your volunteer role and the things that you're being told to do and not do, and the things you're told to tell other people and how you're supposed to tell those other people.
Because you've been coached on how to give people hard news
of course.
In ways that felt deceptive for you, But you were told it's the right way to do it.
You know, there's a tactful way of talking to people. I mean, I do that all the time.
Yeah.
But there's
But
also
tactful doesn't have to be dishonest or deceptive.
Correct. And so there's lots of things like that. That's what I mean when I was having a hard time pinpointing. I was like, there's so many little things that I could think about that would equal to a huge, ball of deception.
I'll give you one that you've probably seen because you were involved in worship, and I've seen this. You have a person who is put on stage because they're a person of color, they are a woman, or they have a look, and the church wants to look diverse.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean they're bad worship leaders or
no, it doesn't mean they're bad at all.
But there's a specific point to it.
They want to put them on for that reason, but they don't feel like they're excellent enough. But we've got to have someone who looks like this on stage. So we put you on. You can hear yourself in your in-ear monitors, but we muted you and nobody else hears you.
I've got another example of that.
Right. Have you seen that, Vicki?
Absolutely.
It goes,
but we don't tell that person, and they're deceived
Yeah.
that they're giving their gift when the reality is we're using you for the way that you look or to show ourselves as diverse. And if we have to do that, we're probably not very diverse.
well, you're deceiving the people and you're deceiving the person
serving.
who's serving, but also in that
And
same
if they
vein.
ask, they get told, well, it's just the way that we mix the harmonies together.
Yeah.
We can hear you out in the congregation.
In that same vein, you've got the miracle offerings and stuff like that. I know you've experienced this. There have been times where they say, we have 3 services, we have 4 services. Every time you need to take an empty envelope and go put it in that miracle offering to get other people to do it. It's an empty envelope.
You've had to do this specifically.
I have had to do that.
My wife's had to do it. And so that's how I know
How many
it firsthand.
services did you have to do that for?
Well, I mean, at least 3 in a row.
And so did you ever ask, why am I having to put the empty
No,
envelope
I
in?
knew exactly why.
You're not giving, but if
We're
y'all
making
give,
the like, okay. So then at first when I was like, okay, well, I'm showing that it's like I'm modeling good behavior, right, as a Christian. And so I looked at it that way, but then I was like, this is kind of ridiculous.
no, what they know is
Nothing
when
in this envelope.
y'all are told to move immediately, and in a service, when you see people move, it puts pressure on you to move. I'll give you another similar one, and this came out publicly first years ago with Elevation Church, right? And there's news articles about this. I've seen this in other churches I've worked at, and other churches I've done work with. Let's just say. Okay, I didn't work out, but I've done work with, where they have spontaneous baptism days. Okay, I don't know if you've ever been a part of a spontaneous baptism, but it's people didn't schedule their baptism. We give them a chance to be baptized. I'm totally fine with that. Okay, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I have seen those services set up to where it's like, hey, as soon as we do this countdown or we say this thing, all the volunteers who are helping with baptisms and sometimes worship leaders and just other people who help, we ask you as soon as you hear that, stand up and walk out.
Yep.
Right? Because when you stand up and walk out and we're all clapping and everything, then somebody who's thinking about getting baptized looks around and goes, look at all those people moving. I should move too. I can move too. And what it's doing is instead of letting them make that decision, it's manipulating them to do that because the first 100 people that move are volunteers who aren't getting baptized.
So it's funny that you
They're
bring
planted.
this up because I remember at a certain church that do this often that I attended and served at, and inviting my family. My brother had just moved into Knoxville again, and so I was like, well, why don't y'all come to church with us, see if you like, where I'm going. And so it was an Easter service, and we do the baptism, just like you're saying. And later, this is just recently, like 2 months ago, this is years ago when this happened. And just recently, like 2 months ago, we were on the phone talking, my brother and I, and he was like, and I told him, I didn't know if you knew, but I'm not going there anymore. And he was like, actually, I didn't know that, and I'm sorry that you're not going there. You don't have a home right now. You don't have a church home. And so we were talking as to why, and he said, well, I'm just going to tell you, that time you had me visit at Easter, my immediate reaction was, this is very cultish. And I was like, well...
And it's hard to see cult-like
things,
behavior inside of it.
when you're in there. And then I was like, yeah, but you're kind of right. Now that I'm out and I see, I was like, wow,
Well, because that stuff's all about control. So
I'm not calling them a cult. Please let me, because anybody
we've got
me with
episodes,
whatever, but like it's cult-ish behavior.
Yeah, and we've got multiple episodes on cultish behavior. You can have cultish behavior and not be a cult. You can exhibit narcissistic behavior and not be a narcissist. We interviewed a pastor, and he was pushing on me about some stuff, and I just told him. He gave me a really narcissistic response, and I said, "Hey, we don't do that. That's a narcissistic response. Try again. We're not going to do that." And his immediate thing was, "You're calling me a narcissist now?" No, I'm not calling you a narcissist. That was a narcissistic response. If you check the tape, I've called myself guilty of narcissistic responses multiple times. Okay, we're all capable of it.
Yeah.
So,
My point is though is to be authentic though, because like you're saying is you're putting pressure on people. Are they actually ready for it? Because if they're not ready for it, then what are we doing? Why are we baptizing people if they're not actually fully invested in doing that, unless they're just feeling sort of pressured, just like peer pressure?
Well, I can tell you why. Okay,
being
and again,
authentic. Well, I know it's about numbers, but
no. So I'm going to tell you more than that, right?
Okay.
And this is not, guys. Again, as you're listening, this is not every church. This is not every
No, of
church
course
that
not.
does spontaneous baptisms.
Absolutely not.
But I will pull back the curtain so that you can ask questions. We don't want you to think this is every church, because it's not.
No.
Okay. But I have been a part of a church staff. I've known many other people who've been a part of church staff, so this is not isolated either. Okay.
Yeah.
But the specific church that you're talking about, there were people, a lot of people whose, whether they got a raise or not at the end of the year was determined by how many people were baptized and their sphere of influence. So yeah, there's a lot that
Shoot,
you
not
can
just raises if they had a job at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you have to have so
sometimes
many,
not even
right.
losing your job. So even
There's
though
a
you
quota
may
they
not
have to meet.
want to manipulate people, you're willing to do manipulative things and justify it to take care of your staff, to take care of you. If that's what it takes to get them to move, then surely it's not that bad. We're not flat out lying to them. Again, it's deception.
Yeah.
It's not lying.
But I guess my point is though, it's like why is that one of the things that we have to have numbers of to legitimize the ministry?
Because denominations ask for it, because other people ask for it, and when again it becomes about ego.
It makes you look better as a organization if you have high baptism numbers, high salvation numbers, like
High
that
attendance.
pastor saying, "I see that hand. I see that hand. There's no hands."
See, that's where I was
I
about to
know,
go.
I
That's
know.
where I was about to go.
I've looked before.
Yeah.
I've
That's-
peeked. Sorry, I have.
Yeah,
And
that's
I'm like,
one of
there's no hands up.
That's one of the most deceptive practices in churches of all sizes is, hey, if you want to accept Christ today, you want to make that decision, you want to raise your hand. I see you. I see you. I see that hand. I see that hand. The amount of people who have looked and peeked and said, "Oh my goodness, they're lying," right? It's crazy.
And if somebody's never been to church before and doesn't know the experience, but is thinking about, this sounds right to me, they may not be bowing their heads. They may not understand, like, why would I bow my head and close my eyes? I mean, I don't. They might be looking around and be like, "Oh yeah, I don't want a part of that."
Mhm.
That can actually turn people off if you're not careful.
Yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
because that's a flat out lie. And that one, people will they will say, I might have missed somebody, this, that, or the other. There's excuses. That one's a flat out lie, though. And I'll tell you, it goes even farther. I had to call out a friend in ministry about it one time, right? A friend who I love, who is, for the most part, an honest person, but they felt the pressure to make it look good. Hey, I see that hand. I see that hand. If you raise your hand, will you pray this prayer with me? Get done with the prayer. And it's, "Hey, church, can y'all help me celebrate with all those who gave their lives to Christ today?" And I'm like, bro, nobody's gave their life to Christ or raised their hand in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
We're making people
me.
think that every week people are being saved because
Yes.
it makes us look better.
Yes.
But again, it comes back to ego. And not only does it come back to ego, I've had this thrown in my face when we were doing spiritual discipline, Shawn and Vicki. We were doing spiritual discipline, talking to an elder board about abusive practices, right? They came back and they said, well, they looked at like a survey that said they were a best Christian workplace. They looked at baptisms, they looked at attendance, and they said, hey, if all these things are happening, people are coming, we're growing, people are getting saved, they're getting baptized, then how could we be an abusive environment? And then that is used to justify anything that's going wrong.
Sure.
Yep.
And to me, it's more legitimate for someone to. I think we should just I don't like that full whole, like, I've got to say this with everybody else to make them feel comfortable. And I'm like, I've said this prayer 50,000 times, it feels like, and it, and it kind of gets a little gross feeling, like, and not the actual like giving, but I know who my Savior is.
Well, I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So,
because not all churches do that, but you were a part of a church where it was, hey, let's all pray this together,
Yes.
repeat after me every week. And
Sure,
that can feel a little cultish sometimes.
Yeah.
it feels a little, and so then I'm like, to me, I mean, and then sometimes some people may not even want to go down front, like, hey, we're going to do a call to the altar, you can come down here. To me, that's putting people on the spot too. And to me, if you're giving yourself to Jesus, I mean, yes, some people will be bold about it if they finally get want to do that, but not everybody's like that. It's maybe a very intimate, personal thing, which you can do in the middle of your home by yourself and claim him as your Savior. So, but my thing is like, give the opportunity for people up like that and make it more legitimate, and give them like, hey, after the service, we have people down here that will pray with you for whatever you need, and even if it's you want to give your life to Jesus. And to me, that is more legitimate and authentic than that.
Oh yeah. Well, here's a better number than baptisms and salvations and everything else. A better number to me is what percentage of those that you baptized are paired in a discipleship relationship and still a part of the church 6 months later?
I can answer that because my niece got baptized at a certain church, and she was connected very briefly with a small group, and then it just sort of teetered off and nothing.
Small groups often are not discipleship.
No, that's what I'm saying.
They're community, and that's great.
Their answer, because
yes,
that's
it is,
the
because
way
they don't understand discipleship
for
I think,
large
sometimes.
groups, like
or it's
that.
hard.
We're going to do a deep dive into discipleship soon, right? But again, those are better numbers. But when we're being given those baptism salvation numbers, guys, they feel so good because we all want people to come to know Jesus.
Absolutely.
We want to think our church is successful. Well, now we don't ask questions. So it becomes a bit of a smoke screen, and it becomes a defense. There were so many people when we spoke out against Gateway. There were so many people who said, yes, Robert Morris did something wrong, but one, he can be restored. You should forgive him. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Forgiving the person has nothing to do with restoring them as a Christ follower has nothing to do with restoring them to a position of power.
Yeah.
But the other thing that they would say is, but look at all the good that's come from his ministry. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And it's like, no. The good you've done in ministry is not a defense for sin.
No, absolutely.
It's never a defense for sin. So think about the Gateway situation. I'll give an example there. And then this is something that I've seen personally, and I think you've probably seen it too, Shawn, in some different places. But in the Gateway situation, before anything came out, their elders sent an email to the staff, okay? And it basically said, if any media reaches out to you, this is our response. This is our spin.
Oh, yeah. I've had that email.
I've gotten that email from different places where it didn't come out like Gateway. But hey, if the media contacts you, this is our story. If they have any other questions, you tell them to come to this person.
Yeah.
Right. And it feels so slimy. I'm being told, you're not asking me what I think. You're telling me what I should think. Right.
What to say.
So all of those are examples of deception. There's a lot more, but I just want us to bring all this together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We've given a lot of examples so that people can hopefully see this. But the formula for spiritual abuse is always power plus deception. Okay.
Yeah.
Unchecked power, okay, concentrated power paired with deception. Even if it's not technically lying, it is deception. Why do we deceive? There is no reason to deceive other than to manipulate someone to either move or to think differently about me than what they should. Okay. We don't lie for good reasons. Sometimes we say, oh, I'm lying to protect this person. No, you're not. You're lying to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. When we have power issues, power abuse plus deceptions, it is going to equal spiritual abuse. So this is why this is so important. Some of you are going to be listening and you're going to say some of those things, like the way they present stuff in the annual report, that doesn't seem like a big deal. I'll give you an example. Okay. Let me give you an example of someone giving excuse for this. I believe this episode will have aired by the time we air this one. But I did an interview with Jerry Lawson, senior pastor at Daystar Church. Okay. I wasn't coming after him. He came after us on social media with a bunch of stuff. I invited him to have a conversation, on the podcast. He, agreed. I thought it was going to be a good conversation, like most of the ones we have with pastors. And I felt like it was exactly what's wrong with a lot of churches. Okay. And I'm not saying he's a bad dude. I'm not saying this is a bad pastor. I asked him about plagiarism, and you can go back and look at that episode. But I asked him about plagiarism because I said, hey, you got this organization that you run that's tied to your church that promotes sermon plagiarism. And he explained to me why he doesn't believe that plagiarism applies to the church. I gave him definitions. He said, this isn't plagiarism. So I gave him definitions, multiple definitions, and said, this is by definition plagiarism. And he literally said, I don't care what you looked up or what the definition says. I just care about helping these pastors. And he framed it as, you don't care about helping these pastors, but I do, right? I don't care what the definition is. I don't care if this is plagiarism or not. You have Josh Howerton, who did the same thing. Josh Howerton, a year ago, wrote a blog post when he was caught plagiarizing sermons. He wrote a whole blog post explaining why plagiarism doesn't apply to pastors, right? And then in the last 3-4 months, he had to make an apology because of something boneheaded he said in a sermon. And when he made the apology, Julie Royce comes out, puts it side by side. He plagiarized his whole apology.
Yeah.
It was the exact same as a mentor's apology.
Yep.
Right. And then he came
Word
out.
for word.
He came out and said, again, point you back to the blog post, it's not plagiarism. That's my mentor. And he coached me through what to say. He gave me permission. It doesn't matter if you have permission, it's still plagiarism, right?
Yeah.
So again, plagiarism can seem like it's not a big deal. And a lot of these pastors are saying it's not a big deal. Here's what I told Jerry when he told me that, though. I didn't say, Jerry, I think you're evil. I didn't say, Jerry, I think you're a bad person. I don't think he is. I think he loves Jesus, right? But I said, if you're willing to justify plagiarism and deceive people in that way, then it is a real slippery slope. You're going to do it somewhere else. It's going to grow somewhere else. So why some deception's worse than others? Why do we say deception of any kind is a precursor to spiritual abuse? Because deception will only grow. You don't deceive and they go, I didn't like the way that felt. I'm not going to do that again. No. Deception, when you get by with it, it grows. Okay. And when you pair deception, you can have deception and it's dangerous, but it doesn't always lead to spiritual abuse. You can have power issues. It's dangerous. It doesn't always lead to spiritual abuse. When you have power and deception, okay, power abuse and deception, it will always lead to systemic spiritual abuse. And a lot of times it's never people whoever said, I'm going to make the decision to hurt people in the name of Jesus. But it was such a slippery slope that they got there and they think that they are doing a service to the kingdom when they do this. It's why we have to call it out, because their own deception goes so far that they become self-deceived, right? Self-decepted. If you have been through spiritual abuse, I want you to look back at the situation where you were hurt. And I want you to look back and I guarantee you're going to find there were issues of power and there were deceptions.
I would even say that in most cases, you can't have deception without issues of power.
Hey, Disruptors, have you heard about the Church Disrupted community? It's an online community for Church Disrupted listeners where you can ask questions, you can connect and talk with other like-minded people who've experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse, and you can ask honest and vulnerable questions without judgment of any kind. And that's without the trolls, the anger, and the constant arguments that tend to come with social media. And the best part is it's 100% free because of our gracious and generous donors. So, if you've experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma of any kind, and you're on the healing journey, I want to invite you to join me in the Church Disrupted community. You can join at disrupted.church or spiritualabuse.institute. And we're also including a link below where you can join just through the description. So, what are you waiting for? Join the Church Disrupted community for free today. We can't wait to meet you.
In most cases, you can't have deception without issues of power. Because
people will call it out.
Well, yeah, because ultimately a deception, I guess successful deceptions. That's a better way to put it. You can't successfully deceive people without a power issue, because ultimately deception is a power play. It's manipulating. It's trying to move somebody into a different direction, which is a power over that person. Yeah. So, but you can have power issues without deception.
Yeah.
I think that's totally possible. I just don't see how it's super.
Well, here's the thing. I would ask you this, Shawn. Mm-hmm. Can you keep unchecked, concentrated power without deception?
No.
So you can have it,
Not
but you
extended.
can't keep it.
Yeah.
That's why these two go together. Okay, so here's what I want to look at before we get to just kind of final messages for pastors and parishioners. I just pulled up the Roy's report, which they're not reporting on everything. I'm just looking at some of the big investigations, okay?
Mhm.
I'm going to throw out some scandals and investigations from the last couple of years that have rocked the church world. And I want you to tell me, and if you don't know, you can ask questions, but I want you to tell me if you see power and deception in there from the reporting. And again, if you're not sure, ask questions. Robert Morris and Gateway Church.
Oh, yeah.
Super concentrated power with the Morris family.
Mhm.
Nobody outside the elder board could hold him accountable. And then you had a lot of deception for years. He actually came out and said, "Oh, I talk about this all the time. I'm honest about this." And then you go back and look at the record. No, you're not. We found out that the victim had reached out to elders previously in previous years, and they knew what her age was, and they still didn't do anything about it.
Mhm.
Okay. Let's go back a couple of years. This one really rocked Christendom. This guy was like a hero of mine because of how he handled apologetics. Ravi Zacharias dies. We're all heartbroken. And then it comes out that, man, he had all these massage parlors and was involved in a ton of moral, sexual, issues and abusing women, right? Well, what did we find out? Was there power? Was there deception?
Well, to be able to do that stuff, you have to have some level of unchecked power.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, we didn't know about that till after he died, and that's
And he's
deception.
completely deceiving people if he's
Yeah.
involved in that and then saying this over here.
Completely deceiving people, having things like NDAs, and they had a whole kind of group of people who just shut people up. They had the power to shut people up if they questioned Robbie.
Which is
Right.
probably, yeah.
Let's look at someone who has been in the news now for over a decade because they just can't quit. Mark Driscoll started at Mars Hill.
Yeah.
Now he's at Trinity Church in Scottsdale. He's in the news somewhere all the time. He has an opinion on everything, yet very little spiritual fruit. But let's think about Mars Hill and that whole deal. And if you don't know about that situation, you can go back, listen to the Rise and Follow Mars Hill podcast. Incredible series on that. But they detail time and time again unchecked, concentrated power to Mark,
Mhm.
where people couldn't question him, and a lot of deception. What actually started the ball rolling on him getting removed was when the news story came out that he had gotten his books on the New York Times bestsellers list by working with a group that basically had the church buy his own books. Because if you
Yeah.
bought 10,000 in the first week, then he'd get on the bestsellers list. And they were using, from all accounts, it looks like they were using tithe money and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Right. But again, you can go check that out. That's public record. Check out the news stories. I may be getting some details wrong, but there was definitely abuses of power.
Mhm.
There was definitely deception. Okay. Let's think about IHOP, KC, and Mike Bickle that has been going on this year. A lot of people came out to, protect Mike Bickle. These are false accusations, all of that. Well, it ends up more allegations come out. Mike had unchecked power. Mike had concentrated power, and he had deceived time and time and time again. What about Hillsong? Whether you're talking about Hillsong New York and Carl Lentz, who is at least, he's telling the truth on his new podcast about this stuff, which I really appreciate him diving into it.
Yeah.
But even probably a bigger deal is Brian Houston and all the stuff that's come out about him, in the last few years.
Mhm.
He's had documentaries made about him. He's been removed from ministry, all that. It all goes back to there was power. There was deception.
Yeah.
Even after, Hillsong could say, we got rid of Brian Houston, we moved on, that was him, that wasn't us. Well, they've had just in recent months, they've had a woman who was a previous student at Hillsong College who came out and has said, hey, I was essayed
Mhm.
by another man on staff, right?
Yeah.
They ended up going to a settlement with her in court, but what they required for the settlement is you have to sign this NDA. And she said, no, I will not give up my voice. I will not take your money, right? They're still doing it. That's happened in the last few months,
Yeah.
right? And we talked about that on another podcast. You can think about the stuff with James McDonald at Harvest Bible Chapel. You can think about some of the allegations that have come out against ARC and Church of the Highlands. It always feels like there's some deception there. It looks like the power in most ARC churches is concentrated to the lead pastor and a group of outside elders. And a lot of those guys who were serving as overseers, like people like Dino Rizzo, they're doing it at multiple churches.
Yeah.
There's no way, and there's people that I love outside of ARC, like Dr. Michael Brown. He is an overseer for quite a few churches. I like the guy, but there's no way he can be realistically overseeing well and giving oversight to all those churches. Think about Willow Creek. when the stuff came out about Bill Hybels.
Mm-hmm.
Tons of power issues with Bill Hybels. Nobody could question Bill. And there was ridiculous amounts of deception. You think about Albert Tate at Monrovia Fellowship, and he is still there, right? But you have a whole town hall meeting with church members asking for an independent investigation and everything else, and him and his outside overseers basically just said, nope, we're not going to do that. They refused to answer questions about, severances and hush money payments and everything else. Tons of deception. We talked about that on previous episodes. But again, it was there, and you just keep going through thing after thing after thing after thing. Every time we look at one of these situations, there's power issues, and there's deception.
Here's the thing for me. After hearing all that, and I don't want this to be misinterpreted. I think when especially when pastors do stuff like this, it's not excusable and it's not in any way okay. But in a certain sense, I feel bad for them because people around them have allowed them to get in these positions. They've done it too. I'm not excusing anything that they've done. Don't hear me say that. But when you have those people around you who can make people be quiet, you are doing this pastor a disservice by not bringing it to people's attention. If it stopped early, how many pastors would have been saved? Carl Lentz would probably still be, reaching thousands. You got all. I'm not going through a whole list, but all these pastors, if it had been stopped early enough, if it hadn't been hushed up, and if it hadn't been a bunch of yes people around them just being like, let's cover it up, let's make it look good, maybe they would have been able to be restored. Maybe they would still be. Maybe it would never even gotten that far. But we have, as a church, they have gotten to places where they cover these things up. They dishonor these pastors by hiding it, and they ultimately help them on their way to disqualification from ministry and hurting thousands, even millions of people. I mean, throughout history, how often has this happened? Because there's people who want to keep the power. And if there's people around you saying, yes, we're going to help you do this. You're great at this. We believe in you. We want the numbers. We want the money. Because they get the money and power as well.
Well, you don't get to a position of power in a lot of these churches unless you're willing to help protect the person in power.
Right. And if this would stop sooner, and I mean, I believe that's the whole reason for church discipline laid out how it is in Matthew 18. It's to stop it sooner. It's to keep these kind of things from happening, not only to protect the sheep, but to protect the shepherds.
Yeah. Well, it's to protect everybody.
Yeah.
And think about it. We talked about this a lot. We got videos on this. We got a whole series on NDAs, but NDAs wouldn't be a thing if people didn't sign them.
Yeah.
They're a thing because we sign them because we need the money.
Yeah.
Right. But the whole point is we give you this money so that you will tell a deceptive story.
Yeah.
About why you left, what was happening. Right. So, as you just think about this, like this is, I think, so helpful for people, but let's make it really practical. Because a lot of people have, they've been through spiritual abuse, not just a lot of people. If you've been through spiritual abuse, you've seen this, or if you look at it, you're going to see it. There was power plus deception.
Yeah.
We can look at all of those stories. We could go into detail and spend hours on it. Every single one of those recent scandals, there's been power issues plus deception, right? But practically, we've stumbled on this and broken down this formula for spiritual abuse. What does this mean for parishioners to you? And what does this mean for pastors? What is your message out of this podcast to parishioners? Both those who have experienced spiritual abuse and those who have heard about it, but have turned a blind eye to it. But also, what's the message for pastors and church leaders, and not just staff, but church leaders as a whole?
For parishioners, this may sound odd, but I think there are some sheep who are called to be shepherds, but aren't listening. And sometimes you're called to fight for the others. Sometimes you're called to step up and stand up. I've seen so many people who get mad and angry and who are like, this isn't right. And they quit and they leave. And sometimes that's the answer. Sometimes you do need to do that. Sometimes you're not called to be the one to stand up. And sometimes you need to, as a parishioner, you need to go find somebody somewhere.
Well, if we all left when things started going sideways with power and deception, then there would be no power to keep.
True. Yeah. But for those times where other people don't see it and they can't, they're blind to it and they're potentially going to get hurt. If you're called to step up and if you have the ability to do something, stand up and fight. If you're not, and it's an unhealthy situation, you see these things, it's okay to leave. I grew up in a place where, they would talk down about church hoppers. They're just trying to find the right church. And there are some people who do that, I'm sure, whatever. But there are times where people just dismiss the hurt because people are going from situation to situation.
Well, if people are leaving your church, staff and parishioners, and it's always their fault, and your church is never learning anything about how they can get better, if it's always their fault, something's going wrong at your church.
Yeah. And for pastors, for me, is starting out. I mean, some it may be too late for. They may be so deep into it that there's no going back, so they just try and keep digging that hole deeper. But if you're going to become a pastor, or if you are a pastor, or if you're starting out, or if you've been a pastor for a long time, but you don't have these current issues, put people around you who are going to knock you upside the head if they need to. People who have the authority to speak into it, people who have the authority to say, you're not going to do this. And if you go against that, they have the ability and the way to make sure that doesn't happen in every way possible. If you don't have that accountability, you are at some point going to be dragged into this kind of thing. Yeah. You just are, because it's human nature and we're all human.
Yeah. Well, as the guys, it's Chris Ayub with the religion business. He always says this. He says humans are going to human. Mm-hmm. We have to put systems in place and we have to hold each other accountable because we're all human, and humans are going to human if we're not checked, if we're not held accountable. Vicki, what about you? Like, what's your practical message for people coming out of this?
I think I just want to say that it's okay to question. Mm-hmm. It is okay to question. You may not have, you may not feel comfortable speaking up, because I agree with what you were saying, Shawn. Some people will definitely do that while others don't feel comfortable doing that. Mm-hmm. But if you question it, maybe there is a way that you can get answers to what you're questioning, in some way or another. And I think that applies too to the people that are on staff. You know what? It's okay to question what I'm being asked to do. Is that okay? And if I lose my job, well, is this really a place I want to work? I think at one point, at one point is it not okay for you? And so I wish pastors would think that as well. Like, I mean, what in the end are we doing here? Because ministry is supposed to be about bringing people to Jesus and loving them. It is not about money and power. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, a lot of the modern church today, it's about numbers and money and power, and it's heartbreaking. So we got to question what we're doing here. What is the end game? So.
Well, and I even think, again, we talked about part of this comes from the hyper focus on leadership in the church instead of serving, right? It's leadership instead of focusing on leadership as one small spiritual gift. We need to focus more on the fivefold ministry. We need to focus on all the spiritual gifts. We need to look at leadership from a biblical perspective. And again, I love, so much what John Maxwell teaches. But one thing that he's said, that he's even said, I've heard him talk about it recently, he would take it back and say it differently now because of the way the world has changed since he said this. But he said for years, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. Okay. But even outside of social media changes and what it means to be an influencer, I look at that, and leadership very well may be influence, nothing more, nothing less. But pastoring and church leadership is not about influence. Mm-mm. Pastoring and church leadership is serving, nothing more.
Period. That's
nothing less.
Yep.
Right. And I get what he's trying to say, but if we're trying to fight for influence, we will lie, we will deceive, because we got to keep that influence. And when you think your deceptions are to help people in the end, you can justify anything.
Well, and I remember, you were sitting here about deceptions, but even self-deception. You said that earlier in our discussion here, and that really oh, wow. Yeah. Like self-deception too. Like this is there's a bigger picture here. It's not just about who you're deceiving, but you can also deceive yourself in this whole grand scheme of things.
Yeah. So, and for me, I'd say a couple of things. One, to the parishioner, if you've been through spiritual abuse, I just want you to know, as you look back and you see this power and this deception, this was not your fault. You're going to get through this. There is healing for you, right? And it's because people misused the power. It's because people deceived that this happened, right? We can't change what happened, but going forward, this lets us know what to look for in churches. If I sniff a whiff of misuse of power or deception, I'm asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't handle those questions and answer them in an honoring way, I'm out. You can call me a church hopper. You can call me whatever you want. It's not that I'm trying to be hard, but once you've been hurt, I just want to give you permission. Once you've been hurt, you have permission to draw a hard line in the sand that may make you overcorrect. But it's because at some point we can't keep getting scarred and get back up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So protect yourself. If you're in an unsafe situation as a parishioner, get out of that. If you have been hurt, learn to recognize these things, ask these questions. And if at any point you don't feel like things are right, even if you can't explain why, move on. Okay? Go somewhere else, because you got to protect yourself. All right? For parishioners that haven't been through that hurt, look for these things. Ask regularly, do I see any signs of these things? We're not trying to see these things where they're not,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to look for these things. And anytime you see a sign of deception, okay, if it's something as simple as, my pastor said I see that hand and I didn't see any hands, go ask, hey, pastor, I don't want to be hard. And I know I probably wasn't supposed to be looking, but you said I see that hand and I didn't see any hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ask the question, right? When they put out the annual report, and hey, these stories are great, could I get a more detailed report of the budget, like basic line items, right? Basic, ideas. Ask those questions, okay? Again, the way that pastors and church staff answer them, if you guys want to go back, we had TJ Malden on the podcast, a while ago. TJ and them, they put their bylaws on the website, so you know exactly how to get rid of the pastor, how to do all these things. They put more detailed finances on their website, like all that sort of stuff. You got churches that are doing a really good job with this. So based on how you ask those questions, the answers you get are going to tell you a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start asking questions the moment we see kind of evidence that there may be deception or power abuse. And if you ask those questions, they're handled well, then you can feel really comfortable about where you're at, okay? And hopefully those questions, even if it's uncomfortable, can save church leaders from going down a slippery slope, right? And if you're a church leader, I'd ask you to do this. I don't know when we air this if we're going to have this completed or not, but we will give a link to it of where you can find it. So if it's not completed, we'll give a link of where you can find it. If it is completed, we're going to link it, okay? And you'll see it on the screen. You'll see it down below. I'm going to ask church leaders who say, we want to be above reproach. We want to make sure that the church isn't getting a black eye because of us. We want to make sure people are served. I'm going to challenge you, as many church leaders as possible. Would you be willing to take the Safe Church Pledge with us? The Safe Church Pledge is an online pledge where you simply commit to say, hey, here are the places where SAI, the Spiritual Abuse Institute, these are the places where we see power and deception crop up the most systemically, right? And that's where you take that pledge and you just say online, my church, and you give us the name, and we'll put you on a list of churches that have pledged and committed to this so that people know this is what my church is committed to. And I can ask questions about these things because my church is committed to be above reproach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's pledging things like we're going to give a good annual report with detail, right? It's stuff like that. So the Safe Church Pledge, it is not going as deep as a church safe assessment or anything like that, but it's a step in the right direction. And as we try to help bring more spiritual abuse awareness, that is something that we're trying to partner with more and more churches, church leaders. Let's decide in advance. This is what we're committed to. And we're going to let the world, we're going to let our parishioners, and we're going to let people who are checking out our church in our city know we're committed to a higher level of accountability and to be above reproach, right? So I would just ask you, if that's you, would you be willing to take that pledge? We're not making any money off that. We're just looking for churches that would partner with us and say, hey, we want to take a step, right?
Yeah.
And if you are a pastor who you're a little convicted, you've heard this, or somebody asked you these questions, or somebody sent you this podcast, and we hope it's not weaponized, but somebody sent you this podcast and you say, you know what, I'm a little convicted. Jeff, I see some of these things. I see some places where y'all talked about it. Maybe I misused some power, even if I disagree with you. Even if you disagree with us, you'd say some of the things y'all call deception I've done, and maybe I don't think they're deceptive. I would just ask you if that's you. Would you sit down? Would you talk with some people you trust? Would you pray about this? And would you ask yourself, could I be more above reproach? What could I do to change this so that I don't bring reproach on my church? I don't bring reproach on my leadership. I don't bring reproach on my Savior, right? Even if we disagree, wouldn't it be worth it to take a step to be so above reproach that you don't even have to worry about it? And that's what I would ask you to do. So again, if as parishioners, as church leaders, if we would all just say, you know what, there's two things we're going to watch out for above everything else. We're going to watch diligently for any signs of power abuse or power concentration in our church. And we're going to watch diligently for any signs of deception. We are going to be so truthful that it hurts us sometimes, but we're going to be honest about the things that happen. And again, with the Church Safe Pledge, it's churches that say we're just committing that when people bring allegations, certain types of allegations, that we're going to have an independent investigation done because we care about the truth, not our ego. Yeah. We care about protecting people, not if it may make the church look bad, because we just want to make sure people are protected. So whatever, let's be diligent about looking for those things. Let's fight those things anywhere we see them crop up, because if we will snuff out power abuse and deception in the church, spiritual abuse will become a thing of the past. And a tagline you're going to hear from us a lot more as we're working on spiritual abuse awareness things. This is something that we're going to have made on shirts and everything else, but it's just something that's near and dear to my heart right now. Church hurt shouldn't be a church thing.
Yeah.
When you think about what Jesus has called us to as the church, the fruit of the Spirit, you think about all that. Church hurt shouldn't be a church thing, and it doesn't have to be. So we're fighting together for a day where church hurt and spiritual abuse are not church things. So anyway, I hope that no matter who you are, where you're at, where you fit into the church, that something about this has encouraged you, it's challenged you, it's sharpened you, and it helps us to ask better questions and to live above reproach. Until next time, guys, grace and peace. We'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.